Between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, there was an age undreamed of. The secret of steel always carried with it a mystery. You must learn its riddle, Conan. You must learn its discipline. If I die, I have to go before him, and he will ask me, "What is the riddle of steel?" If I don't know it, he will cast me out of Valhalla and laugh at me.
You were sleeping. You slept too long. We all have. It's time we woke. Time we stopped running.
Welcome to the Restituta Orbis channel, and today we're exploring Conan's old world, Hyperborea. The interesting aspect of sword and sorcery literature, and we're told that the Conan stories written by author Robert E. Howard was the father of sword and sorcery tales. How does it relate to high fantasy, though, and how does Robert E. Howard's world that he devised in the 1930s fit into our Five Eras timeline? Maybe it doesn't fit into our Five Eras timeline, but could it be an early portion of what we consider the Fourth Era or the Tartarian Era? Or could it be that these stories took place during the Second or Third Eras, and that they recount tales and stories and civilizations from those time frames? We're going to explore that today. We're also going to consider the fact that maybe these are all just fictional stories that someone who only lived for 30 years improvised from their wondrous creativity and imagination. We start by considering the account of Robert E. Howard, the author himself, and the Hyborian Age. Now, the Hyborian Age is what Robert E. Howard, the author, referred to as the time that his main character, Conan the Barbarian, lived in. The Hyborian Age is a contraction of the land Hyperborea, which was a legendary land that the Greeks had thought existed in the north, or what we think of as the Arctic Circle today. Oddly enough, these are the same Greeks that we attribute the foundation of civilization to, and yet we also say that they were superstitious fools who didn't exactly know the layout of their own land. Once again, another conflicted account, this time with what we consider to be the foundation of our current civilization, at least in the mainstream. Looking at the land that Howard improvised or innovated, if you go off of the mainstream account, you can see that there are many parallels with our current land, and yet it looks very different. We consider the fact that the nature of the land may have changed through reset after reset. But who exactly was Robert E. Howard, and what was unique about him as an author? Robert E. Howard was born and lived in Texas his entire life. He only lived for 30 years, 1906 to 1936, during a questionable time, the Roaring Twenties, and of course the Great Depression, which we've looked at many times. Robert E. Howard was a self-taught author. He was someone who taught himself the art of writing, and he had a very difficult life from what we understand. At least he was self-conflicted as an individual. Again, this is the mainstream account. We, oddly enough, know little about him as a person aside from what's written about him. And yet, in the 1930s, he was the one who innovated these fantasy tales, this sword and sorcery genre. Indeed, he's considered the father of sword and sorcery genre, even though he only lived to be 30 years old, and he only had one novel about the Conan stories. Predominantly, the Conan stories and the Hyborian essay that he wrote were simply to appear in many periodicals as short stories. The other interesting thing about Robert E. Howard is the fact that he only did live 30 years, and yet he had this creativity and imagination to innovate this entire world from his mind. He was also a correspondent with H.P. Lovecraft and seemed to share many of the aspects of other realms and the concept of portals and greater powers influencing the world or the land. Yet at the same time, he also disputed H.P. Lovecraft's view of civilization. Howard believed that civilization represented a threat to the individual, whereas Lovecraft was a proponent of civilization. Again, that's what the mainstream tells us. Who knows what the reality is? What was truly interesting, though, about Howard's stories at the time was that they touched on an entirely new genre that supposedly hadn't been revealed to the public before in fiction. Also recall that when most of these Conan stories were originally published as short stories, it was during the time of the Great Depression, and we're also told that Howard was afflicted by the Great Depression. In Howard's fictional narrative, he actually started with stories of Cole the King, which talked about the Thurian continent, or the Thurian Age. this was the time frame that preceded the Hyborian Age, and oddly enough, it refers to Thul, it refers to Atlantis, and Lemuria. Indeed, Howard seemed to recognize that these were civilizations during this particular age. And then there was a great cataclysm, and then this entire civilization was destroyed. And so you can already see that we have many of the allusions to the things that we explore in our Five Eras theory and looking at the old world. Now, once again, this could have just all been the fictional mindset of an inspired author in the 1930s in Texas. And you can look and see some of the examples from the Hyborian Age, or the Age of King Cole. King Cole himself was from Atlantis, and it's odd to consider that Howard was referring to a time when Atlantis existed. Indeed, he states that when the Hyborian Age occurred, it was between the time when the oceans drank Atlantis and the rise of the sons of Arius, or what we consider to be the more quote-unquote modern civilizations, Sumer and Babylon. We'll also be exploring them here in the near future. It's intriguing, though, that what Howard's view of this point is that this particular series of civilizations had magic and had many other intricacies involved in its civilization. And recall that we're told that Howard considered civilization evil, although if you go off of mainstream history, one could understand why we would have that perception. Although we don't really know much about Howard directly. We know that the Hyborian Age was succeeded by the Hyborian Age, and this was the age in which Conan the Barbarian, the eponymous character of Howard's most well-known stories, and the very well-known movie that was made in the early 1980s, launching the acting career of Arnold Schwarzenegger. What makes Conan special, and what makes the Hyborian Age that Robert E. Howard wrote about unique? It improvised, in many ways, story elements that were told were not in existence at that time. It also incited the start of the sword and sorcery genre. Now you're probably asking, what's the difference between sword and sorcery and high fantasy, or what we think of with the Lord of the Rings series, which we explored in the works of Tolkien last year on this channel? Sword and sorcery allegedly just involve stories that are simply a single individual struggling in the same sort of environment that you tend to see in high fantasy, whereas high fantasy stories, primarily written by Tolkien, involve the entire fate of the world. At least that's the simple way to understand the differences between high fantasy and sword and sorcery, yet they involve many of the same elements. Of course, there's also the perception that sword and sorcery tends to reflect a much more violent and individualistic nature, which supposedly goes along with the values that Robert E. Howard embraced. The other interesting thing looking at Hyboria, though, is supposedly Howard was inspired by the existence of nations, and certain kingdoms within Hyboria, or the Hyborian Age that existed, Aquilonia and several others, are allegedly inspired by real-life kingdoms, or real-life city-states in Italy even, such as Aquilonia. However, in the film, we also see a wonderful depiction and an interpretation of what Howard may have imagined. We also have to remember that most of the works of Conan were written by other authors over time. Since Howard passed away, he committed suicide in 1936. We're told that he had a difficult life, and there are many different theories in terms of his internal struggles and conflicts. We just don't know exactly what was going on. It is rather interesting, though, that an individual who only lived to be 30 years managed to completely create this entire world, just with their creativity and imagination. Now, I'm not questioning if Howard did this. It's another interesting consideration, much in the same way as J.R.R. Tolkien, or even more contemporaneously, George R.R. Martin. These entire worlds that are created that give us a reflection of a very distant past time, and yet they show reset events. Consider the character of Conan himself. Conan represents the barbarian. It's in the title, Conan the Barbarian. He represents the ultimate individual from Howard's perception. The person who actually reflects qualities and values that are, according to Howard in the stories, superior to the individuals that live in civilizations. Yet, really, when it comes down to this superiority, it's not so much in one person being seen as better than the other. It's the fact that Conan embraces certain values that tend to be lost in civilizations. So perhaps Howard was simply given a warning in his character of Conan. You see no shortage of exotic creatures in elaborate accounts, such as snakes that are 80 feet long. And to this day, we have several accounts of alleged cryptid sightings of gigantic snakes in distant areas across the land. Maybe they exist, maybe they do not. Or maybe they existed in the past. Our mainstream says that giant snakes existed in the past. Of course, it's in the very distant past, as it always is. A lot of the landscapes and civilizations, and indeed the existential threat that was facing Hyperborea, was indeed reflected by the presence of snakes, or the worship of the snake god Set. And we'll discuss that when we look into the civilization of Stygia in Hyboria. Oddly enough, there is also numerous references to the power of a new form of religion and influence, which indeed was the worship of Set, which is very well reflected in the early 1980s movie, when we see not just the worship of snakes, but also the concept of embracing an identity of void. And indeed, the individual who is responsible for this, the character Thulsa Doom, embraces a twisted misanthropy in the film. We also see how Conan acquires his great sword, an Atlantean sword, when he falls into an old Atlantean tomb. And we see that the Atlantean king, or general, or whatever you want to think of him as, is a giant individual. Now again, this is just reflected in the story, but there's also a lot of symbolism. Indeed, what made the original Conan the Barbarian so successful as a film was that it relied a lot more on symbolism, on music, and on telling a story through visual elements instead of dialogue. Conan doesn't really speak a lot of dialogue, and indeed this happened to cater to the strengths of Arnold Schwarzenegger's ability to convey a physical performance. And not to denigrate Arnold Schwarzenegger's acting capability, but you're simply catering to an individual's strengths, and it's one of the reasons why the film worked so incredibly well. It also had a wondrous theme concerning the Riddle of Steel. What was the real search behind it? And the film doesn't tell you what the answer to the Riddle of Steel is, but it does display it very clearly in the entire plot. The other threats that Conan faces do tend to be the corruption of civilization, and that's depicted both in the original stories and in the way that it's depicted in the film. Now, there's numerous changes made to Howard's original characters, and of course, if you go to the city in Italy to this day that Aquilonia was inspired by, one of the kingdoms in Hyboria, you'll see that they have a nice collection of bells there. And that's just another little odd coincidence that we have when we consider the power of bells and what they could be representing in our many previous civilizations. There's also statements that Howard was inspired by individuals such as the Picts and other tribes that supposedly existed in history, but strangely enough, we have conflicting accounts about them as well, in terms of how civilized they were, how advanced they were, and it tends to create many different conflicting accounts. Officially, we're told that the reason Howard did not want to utilize actual history was it would have been too difficult to do the research to incorporate it into his stories at the time. Yet, he didn't have a Carnegie Library nearby in Texas, and of course we're well aware of many libraries at that time. We're also told that he innovated these great kingdoms and these lands in this time of Hyboria. But what would have been easier? Would it have been easier simply to go off of what was already written, or to innovate it? Or is it possible that he was actually consulting a different historical account, an alternate series of events? We even have accounts of apes that evolved into men that evolved further beyond that, and within a very compressed time period. A lot of people will find that there was a lot of controversy in Howard's works at the time, although the concept of controversy evaluating Howard's work seems to ebb and flow depending on the current state of events, which we can really say about anything. We certainly love to discuss how everything's controversial here in the 2000s. But you also see the other element of the Hyborian Age with the constant conflicts and civilizations that are rising and falling, and that's something else that Howard tended to emphasize in his works, and indeed in some of the letters that we have in his exchanges with H.P. Lovecraft, he argued for the fact that there never really was one dominant civilization. Civilizations would rise, civilizations would fall. There was never really one that would ultimately hold the keys towards eternal existence. And yet Howard believed that the real strength, the real enduring quality of human beings was actually in the strength of the individual. And that explains a lot of his viewpoints and what we see in the stories. Now let's look at Stygia and Thulsa Doom. Stygia was considered a corrupted nation, a corrupted land that worshipped the snake god Set. There's a lot of interesting elements when you consider Stygia, especially given their entire culture and society. The high priests of Set within Stygia held all the influence. Now, supposedly Stygia was inspired by many different civilizations that are actually written about in history, and indeed we have no shortage of supposed honest historical accounts that talk about the primacy of sacrifice and how that would contribute to a civilization in the past. We certainly enjoy attributing that to the Aztecs, and it's one of the darker aspects of that civilization, if it did in fact occurred. Yet, oddly enough, when you step far enough back, you can find many examples of sacrifice, conducted in many different formats. Of course, the justification for sacrifice changes. In the past, we're told that sacrifice was done by a superstitious people, so it would preclude the natural events of the world overcoming them. And yet, one of the darker elements of Stygia is the fact that they took sacrifice as an essential element of their society. There's no shortage of depictions, innovations, and creative artistic renderings that show how these sacrifices that were dedicated to the snake god of Set were conducted in Stygia. And indeed, the priests of Stygia and what they proposed for maintaining their civilization in balance with nature is a very alarming and disturbing story to look at. There is also the entire presence of snakes. Now, recall that earlier in explorations on this channel, we don't want to condemn simply the presence of snakes, but it comes down to how the symbolism is used and employed when we look at Stygia. It's also stepping back and looking at this kingdom, this civilization that supposedly came from the mind of Robert E. Howard, and yet there's some other disturbing elements that seem to bear some sort of realism in it. There's even the account of the snake god Set himself, or itself. The fact that it exists in multiple dimensions, that it can travel through portals, that it has all sorts of power. The power to deceive, the power to transform, the power to assume multiple forms, the power to create and destroy. We're even told that between the Thurian and the Hyborian Age, or if you want to see as a reset being between those, Set was always one of the main individuals, the main deities that opposed the progress of humanity. And normally this was done in the stories through the advent of a corrupted civilization, which was represented by Stygia. In the 1982 film Conan the Barbarian, we see that the main character Thulsa, who was also an antagonist from the original stories, albeit in a very different incarnation, embraced the concept of the worship of Set. And this is the commonality that you see. The character is wonderfully portrayed by James Earl Jones in the 1982 film. And his Thulsa is of an ancient race that's been nearly extinct. The dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa is over 1,000 years old. And he's recruited several priests who have wondrous warrior capabilities, and here you see the high priest Rexer on the right, and his assistant Thorgrim. These are the individuals in the film that carry out the will of Thulsa. And indeed we see Rexer pictured here, who is no doubt Thulsa chosen successor. They recruit a group of followers, which quickly grows into the thousands and tens of thousands, and the dialogue in the film makes it clear that Thulsa snake cult is spreading across the entire world. Every single city has built a tower dedicated to the worship of Set. The people seem to be aware that this is an evil, terrifying threat, and yet no one really seems to have the will to do much of anything about it. Aside from King Osric, whose daughter is recruited by Thulsa to be at his side. And indeed, the main plot element involves King Osric recruiting Conan, Valeria, and Subutai, his companions, to rescue his daughter from the clutches of Thulsa. Thulsa is portrayed wonderfully by James Earl Jones in the fact that he has an understanding of what the Riddle of Steel is really about. He also has tremendous charisma and influence over his followers. The fact that Thulsa can speak with a voice and character inflections such as James Earl Jones, you can see that there's a lot of sense to many of the things that he's stating. When he talks about some of the unfortunate traits of individuals to be easily corrupted. He also shows and displays the power of influence that he has over his followers, when he asks one of his followers to simply come to him and jump off a cliff to her very untimely demise. And one of the points that he makes is the fact that he has this kind of influence, that this is true power. and many people simply give up their own will or don't practice their own will and succumb to the nature of Thulsa Doom. And here you see a very adequate depiction of what was represented by Stygia and this worship of the cult of Set. There is even the fact that Thulsa Doom himself can transform into a large snake, and it's depicted quite directly in the film, where we see Thulsa Doom transform into a snake, and it gives us a showcase of his magical capability, and indeed the unique aspects of the species that he was originally a member of. I like the fact, though, that the film gives you clues about it. It shows you his capability, but it doesn't have to explain the origin in detail, because oftentimes we do have mystery in life. And it doesn't affect the plot of the film, and it doesn't affect what's displayed with solving the Riddle of Steel, but it does give you some clues in terms of how powerful and charismatic certain individuals can be. And we all have to decide if a charismatic individual is really acting on our behalf or not. And you can see here the original depiction of Thulsa Doom as Robert E. Howard allegedly innovated the character. I don't believe that it betrays the actual vision, though, of Robert E. Howard, as the film did combine many of the elements that he had in his original stories, and it did represent many of the themes that he wanted to convey. Indeed, we have to consider the Riddle of Steel to understand the fundamental values. And what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Shall I tell you? It's the least I can do. Throughout the film, it begins with a monologue between Conan and his father. And that was one of the quotes at the start of this exploration, where Conan's father explains that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, the entire film revolves around events of Conan's life. A lot of people think that the original Conan the Barbarian is simply a revenge story. Conan's going to seek Thulsa Doom because Thulsa Doom raided Conan's village to kill Conan's people, his mother, his father, and then steal his father's sword, because as Thulsa Doom said later, he believed that weapons of steel were the key to success. And indeed, we see the terrifying scene where Conan has to witness the slaughter of his mother and his father right in front of his eyes. That's the opening event of his life that occurs shortly after his father tells him about the Riddle of Steel. So, the entire film is about the events of Conan's life. And really, it's about Conan going through events and experiencing things and trying to solve the Riddle of Steel. And as he relays to Subutai, his companion, who's a thief later in the film once he grows up, he says that he has to solve the Riddle of Steel. But what is the answer to the Riddle of Steel? Many people have said that it's simply an expression of will. It's that simple. And indeed, we see Conan's will tested when he's captured after his village is destroyed, and he's chained to the Wheel of Pain, which he pushes for years. We're given the impression that the other survivors from the raid died over time, but only Conan survived, and he achieved a body of great strength and capability just by surviving and pushing the wheel. Conan is recruited to be a pit fighter, and he is involved in many pit fights in which he has no choice but to kill his opponent every time. And so we see that the initial events of Conan's life have been tragedy. He's forced into situations of terrifying violence, witnessing the death of his parents, and then having to kill himself in order to survive. However, as a result of his victories, he's given an education, and he's brought to a higher status. Indeed, he's able to develop himself as an individual, even with the constraints of his particular situation. And soon he earns his freedom, freed by the very individual who had employed him in pit fighting, and he goes off on his own to seek vengeance against Thulsa Doom. Eventually he finds Thulsa Doom, the individual who led the raid of his village, who tells him that flesh is stronger than steel, that he will tell him the answer to the Riddle of Steel. And indeed, that's exactly how Thulsa Doom depicts it, that flesh is stronger. And he makes a very direct allusion to where the real power is, what is steel compared to the hand that wields it, and shows Conan that his influence and power over his followers is infinitely more powerful than the material of steel. He has Conan crucified, and Conan nearly dies until he's rescued by his companions. And it's at this point that Conan begins to reflect inwardly. He's learned through his life and his experiences, and he understands that what he really has to achieve is self-awareness. And when we see the kata after Conan survives his crucifixion, we understand that he's achieved self-awareness. In his final battle against Rexor, Thulsa Doom's high priest, Conan frees himself by breaking his father's sword in combat. This is symbolic. It represents Conan breaking the chains of his past and achieving his self-awareness. and ultimately his self-agency. While he's broken his father's sword, he still shows tribute to his past. He still understands his connections, but now he's no longer bound by it. He has the ability to impose his own purpose, his own values in life. And it's represented during the time when he wins this duel and wins back his father's sword, which he uses to confront Thulsa Doom and ultimately kill Thulsa Doom. Now, it may seem like it's a vengeance story, but behind it, under the surface, we see that Conan has sorted out the Riddle of Steel. And the answer to the Riddle of Steel is that self-agency is what everything is about. Achieving self-awareness through your experiences, that gives you the ability to impose will. That is the answer to the Riddle of Steel. So what era was the Hyborian Age and the Thurian Age, or whatever you want to call these time frames? Remember that the Thurian Age came first. Did it actually happen in the second era, and that's when we had the Thurian Age? Or did the Thurian Age come in the third era? We could see that in any point where we want to see Atlantis and Lemuria actually happening. There's indications for both. Or what about Hyboria? Did the Hyborian Age occur in the third era, or did it occur in the fourth era? Or is it possible that these were all just from the imagination of Robert E. Howard, and that this is all just a fiction? I do consider that possibility. There's also another perception that perhaps both these ages occurred in a single area, the Thurian Age and the Hyborian Age in the second or the third era. Because remember, we don't exactly have a hard and fast line defining between resets. Or maybe they occurred in the fourth era, at the start before the Tartarian civilization. It's an interesting look to see how different people have viewed the past. And it is possible that Robert E. Howard may have had some access, or may simply be another, how shall we say, placeholder individual that released a lot of this information, some sort of disclosure. It could also be possible that this is also similar to what we see released through the works of George R. R. Martin and J.R.R. Tolkien. We just don't know. And yet, when we see these allusions to past and previous civilizations, we realize that there could be much more to this in terms of fact and in terms of historicity. It is rather strange that Robert E. Howard managed to compose an entire Hyborian essay in which he outlined this entire world that he supposedly just envisioned in his mind. Now, I don't want to discredit a single individual's creativity and imagination, but remember that Robert E. Howard lived a very difficult life, and he only lived for 30 years. And yet he was able to innovate something, an entire world all of his own, which other authors and other creators were able to run with for decades, and even continuing to this day. So what do you think? Is it possible that this Hyborian Age really occurred in history, or is it all just from the imagination of one individual? Well, let me know what you think in the comments. Thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.